Thank you, Denise. Thank you, Jonathan. I want to echo that it's a wonderful partnership that we have with the Federation, with the Board of Rabbis. You know, many of you know, I know some of you, and I'm meeting you today, for some of you for the first time, the mission of the Institute has been investing in rabbis for the last 20, 30 years. This was a personal passion of Rabbi David Hartman, alav shalom, and so it gives us great joy as we create Hartman North America to have partners like we do here in Los Angeles and to make continuing rabbinic education a core part of our work here in North America. I want to talk about something I've been thinking about a lot, a little bit of a laboratory today to talk through some issues that I've been thinking about with respect to American Jewish identity. Not what I wrote about in my book, but hopefully, as I said, for the next one. And that is the question of where does Hebrew fit in to the meaning of American Jewish identity? And I want to take this from the positive vantage point before we get into some of the polemicists. From the positive vantage point, it's very hard to deny the ways in which the American Jewish community constitutes one of the most astonishing success stories of Jewish history, right? Whenever you say that and you talk about how great the experience of being American Jews are, cynics in the room will always interrupt you and say, that's what they said in the golden age of Spain. In fact, I actually got interrupted on a panel in Israel once when I was talking about what it means for us to be successful American Jews by somebody who said, there's somebody else on the panel who's Spanish. Why don't you ask him what happens to golden ages? It's like this weird psychic disconnect about the inability to actually appreciate success. So we have this extraordinary sense of arrival in the American Jewish scene, the ability of American Jews it's no longer integrate or assimilate, it's actually to just be Americans, and in some ways to be the paragon of Americanness, so much so that Jewishness, in a weird way, is part of the social is actually kind of a social commodity. And that is signaled by the series of presidential children, nephews, and nieces marrying Jews over the past 5 to 10 years, right? That there's something about Jewishness which it's a banal conversation to talk simply about intermarriage as a challenging phenomenon. It's a much more interesting conversation to talk about intermarriage as a signal of arrival and to ask the questions about what does one do in an environment where one is actually at home and successful. As part of that, I've been thinking a lot lately, in part because there have been a series of very public polemics about this, about American Jewish illiteracy of Hebrew, which let's take basically for granted. You can probably give better data on this than I can. But American Jews, on balance, do not know Hebrew. They certainly don't know it as a fluent language, nor do they know it as a classical language. And I want to just unpack that difference, which will play out, right? There have been plenty of times in Jewish history when Hebrew was not known as a vernacular language, but it was at least the language of the tradition. So I didn't speak in Hebrew, but when I went into the synagogue, I interacted in Hebrew. I had this experience about 15 years ago traveling in Eastern Europe, and I went to a synagogue, and one of the people, the only way I could communicate with the Jew in the synagogue, I think it was in Bucharest, was through biblical Hebrew. Right? He didn't speak modern Hebrew. I didn't speak Romanian, and so we spoke biblical Hebrew to each other. So there's always been an experience of some percentage of the population who, when they're doing Jewish, are encountering Hebrew, whether it's through the prayer book, through the reading of the Torah, and so on. And since, for the past century or so, is the arrival of modern vernacular Hebrew. And American Jews, on balance, know neither. Right? To the extent that they are Jewishly affiliated, they may know some Hebrew through the context of synagogue and prayer. To the extent that they are connected to Zionist institutions, they may have learned Hebrew as part of some education as well. But on balance, for most American Jews, they don't know Hebrew, and they're not particularly troubled by it. Right? Is that a fair assessment? Notwithstanding efforts by the institutional Jewish community to mount credible campaigns to teach Hebrew, perhaps best exemplified by the phenomenon known as Hebrew schools, right? We're not called Jewish schools, but we're called explicitly Hebrew schools. Camp Masad was an effort in this direction, and those have both of those institutions have essentially faded. Hebrew-speaking camps, exclusively Hebrew-speaking camps, and Hebrew schools that are solely promoting Hebrew language. So this is kind of the state of affairs. Notwithstanding that, there have been a series of polemics in the last few years from some likely and some unlikely sources attacking the American Jewish community that this failure to know and understand Hebrew constitutes an existential threat, right? Or at least a kind of hubris or obnoxiousness to believe that you can actually survive as a community without knowing the core language of your tradition. The most pronounced one of these polemics, for which I have some excerpts of, and we'll look at, was Leon Wieseltier in an absolutely trenchant essay called Language, Identity, and the Scandal of American Jewry, which is worth reading because it's a total hoot, right? In the way that it's a really beautifully written essay in which he essentially argues, as we'll see the chapter heading is titled, The Spoiled Brats of Jewish History. Right? American Jews are the spoiled brats of Jewish history, that the failure to learn Hebrew, you can call yourself successful as a community, but if you don't know Hebrew, you are unsustainable, and you can't actually continue Judaism beyond the present. It's one of the assumptions, let me just give a couple more things and I'll take some comments. It's one of the assumptions I want to question today, is a Judaism transmissible in translation? One of the core questions I want to ask that motivates this is, you have a lot of polemics and it's really messy. We're not having a organized conversation about where Hebrew actually matters in identity. We're having a polemical conversation in which you suggest something is wrong with you for not knowing something. I want to organize that conversation and see whether there's a conceptual approach of what Hebrew actually means in order to figure out whether the absence of it is really a problem. So Wieseltier throws this critique against the wall. David Chazoni, of the Shalem Center, I don't think he's at the Shalem Center anymore, wrote a similar critique about a year ago in the foreword called Memo to American Jews Learn Hebrew, in which he argued, and we'll play this out a little bit, that all the most interesting Jewish cultural expression taking place in the world is taking place in Hebrew, through Hebrew poetry and music and the productions of the State of Israel. And the failure to embrace that is missing out on the interesting Jewish cultural conversation. There, too, that's a messy critique. Right? Because there's a lot of interesting Jewish cultural production that's taking place in English or in various Eastern European languages in Eastern Europe. Right? There's a lot going on, but it was a popular and often shared article of look at the scandal of American Jewry that it doesn't know Hebrew. And perhaps I think, to my view, the most surprising polemicist was a close friend and colleague of mine, Rabbi Eli Confer, who runs Machon Hadar at Egalitarian Yeshiva in New York. The Jewish federations, through a short-lived initiative that they called the Global Planning Table, tried to commission about 15 to 20 Jewish thought leaders in America to write short essays to the Global Planning Table to say, if the federations were going to invest a lot of money in one particular initiative or effort, what should it be? And they got all sorts of ideas from different people. And Eli's piece, and these are all available on the Jewish Federations of North America website, Eli's piece, which I was shocked at, and actually I heard from the Federation people, they were shocked at it too, was Hebrew education. Right? What's the one thing that if the American Jewish community wanted to invest in for its own sustainability and future, it should be the teaching and promoting of Hebrew. Now, I was surprised by this, both because Hadar, as an egalitarian yeshiva, is not about Hebrew language fluency. It's about learning Torah fluency, when those are not the same thing. But I was also surprised that given the opportunity, right? If the genie comes along and offers you one wish, what would you ask for to change the course of American Jewish history? And the answer being the teaching of Hebrew language. I'm not saying it's not a reasonable answer. It comports with things I've heard for a number of years from Jewish leaders that if only my congregants knew Hebrew, if only our community spoke Hebrew, then suddenly the tide would be different. I'm not sure I agree with it, but I at least want to test the hypothesis and test the assumption. So this is what I wanted to do today, is to respond a little bit to this polemics and ask the question, first of all, what are we talking about when we talk about Hebrew as a feature of identity? What are we actually referring to when we refer to language in relationship to identity? And then I want to ask, is actually language so critical to Jewish identity or not? I want to put out an example of a Jewish community in antiquity that didn't know Hebrew and felt perfectly good about themselves and thought of itself as being sustainable. And we'll culminate with the question of taking these two things together, what Hebrew actually means as part of a thick Judaism, and the option for a thick Judaism without Hebrew, where do we actually come out on this as rabbis and community leaders? So that's what I'd like to do today. I'll stop and just take a couple of questions. Yeah?
My one curiosity in looking at through history's eyes is the degree to which people actually knew Hebrew in a way that they could communicate beyond liturgy, for lack of a better term.
Right.
I mean, it's not a challenge, it's just more helping to understand where previous generations were. I mean, I don't get the sense that in America we ever really had anything beyond liturgical fluency at best. And in other places before, I don't quite get the people spoke Yiddish for sure when you look at ancient, there's a tie to Hebrew. Mm-hmm. But I wonder how much they really knew Hebrew more so than we do.
Good. I want you to hold on to that question, because as we look through the different templates of what Hebrew means, you may question the assumption along the way that this comparison to once upon a time we knew Hebrew and now we don't is perhaps in itself flawed. I would also add to that, and this is going to be one of our assumptions to test out, everything changes with the modern state of Israel. When Hebrew goes from being a liturgical language to a language that people actually speak, it fundamentally shifts. And when you say, the minute you say, be in relationship to Hebrew, are you making a coded political argument about be in relationship to a different type of identity? So we'll come back to that comment. Yeah, but
another issue for, I guess I'll speak as an educator, is what is the value, and is there any value in Hebrew? I wouldn't say a Yiddish, but a kind of a terminological Hebrew. Just throwing that into the hopper. I have no answer. I mean, I do have answers, but they're my own.
Okay, good.
But I think that, let's call it the non-language, I hate to say jargon, but something like that.
Right, so this is, again, where I want to come back to in the end. Are there ways in which we could accumulate a knowledge level of Judaism through which Hebrew is a feature of it, where we're no longer talking about language, but we're actually talking meaningfully about identity?
Which case, in terms of art or something.
Exactly, right. Any other questions or comments before we jump in? Okay, so I want to try, oh yeah, go ahead.
Too many, but one of the things that hit me the hardest is the lack of Hebrew, and I think there is a big disconnect, even with liturgy, right? Because, when I learned the prayers, and I learned Hebrew, then the prayers were talking to me directly, but and that goes also for Torah and everything else. There's the saying in Italian, traduttore traditore. That means a translator is a traitor, because we lose in translation. Sometimes we gain, but we mostly lose. And I feel this disconnect when we don't have the Hebrew, and as you said, now we have a shift, because now we have Israel,
right?
And but unfortunately, Israelis speak English, so we can't.
Fortunately or unfortunately, I mean, this is what I want to get at is exactly how do you take this sensibility that you have, right? There's something wrong here about the inability to know the language of the things that we're praying, right? The great metaphor is it's like kissing through a veil. Speaking in translation is like kissing through a veil. And part of me says, yeah, maybe, but it's still kissing, right? I mean, like, what are we, right?
It can be very sexy.
Right, so what I want to do is take that feeling, something isn't right here, and try to figure out what are we troubled by? Because I don't think it's the same for this, I don't think that anxiety is the same as what Wieseltier might be talking about, and I don't even think it's necessarily the same with what Eli Confer might be talking about. There's an anxiety here, and I want to try to see whether we could put some rigor behind what that anxiety actually reflects, and then ask whether you can actually meet that anxiety with a meaningful response. Yeah.
Besides inability, what about, since you mentioned the American identity and vis-a-vis Israel when it became a political boundary, there are those in the American Jewish community who go beyond inability and actually have I go so far as saying repulsion in the sense that we don't even need, and that Hebrew becomes an active, a
deliberate choice against Hebrew, right? Right. Okay, good. We're going to get to that with number 2. So let me try to lay out as I see 5 different conceptual understandings of where actually Hebrew fits into Jewishness. In other words, why does Hebrew have this quality? There may be more than 5, and they may overlap a little bit, but 5 different understandings of where Hebrew actually fits, and I think this will help us to align where some of these anxieties and polemics actually fit in. That somebody is responding to one piece of this, and maybe perhaps not another. The first is what you might call mystical or theological, to say it's the words of the Siddur, right? That somehow Hebrew is not just a language, but it's the language. Right? It's the language of God, it's the language of revelation, it's the language of our teaching, and it's the language that we should be praising God in. Right? So there's a whole set of possibilities about what Hebrew means when we associate it with the mystical and theological language. Frankly, I don't think any of the polemicists are actually saying this. I don't think what Leon Wieseltier comes along and saying is American Jews are spoiled brats of history because they're not speaking in God's language. But there is a little bit of what you said, I'm sorry I don't know your name, when you said, right, the speaking in translation from the language of the Siddur misses out on a lot of the loadedness or the weight of the tradition, because a prayer said in English, when it's written in Hebrew, doesn't kind of carry the same weight of the same words. This is articulated very beautifully by Yossi Dan, the scholar of mysticism, Israeli scholar of mysticism, in the first excerpt that I had here from a book called The Heart and the Fountain. And it's actually inside, I learned this, I took a class with him that then became this book, so it was wonderful to hear this. Do we have any, are we short?
Yes, I know, here.
Oh, there's more over there.
Here.
Is there another one?
I can share this one.
Oh, are there more sources?
Anybody else?
Is that the source pack, or is that the, yeah, there.
That's it, yeah.
In a really important insight about Jewish mysticism that Yossi Dan says as follows on the second paragraph of page 1. Judaism differs from Christianity in that it believes that it has recorded in its scriptures the actual word of God in its original language. Christianity, on the other hand, is based on the word of God in translation. The Hebrew Bible included tens of thousands of words believed to be the actual syllables uttered by God or inspired by God. The New Testament includes thousands of words said by Jesus Christ or inspired by him, not in their original form, but in their translation to Greek. Only 6 words uttered by Jesus are recorded as they were actually pronounced. Tali takumi, get up, little girl, when there's a girl lying dead on the floor who he revives. And Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani, God, why have you forsaken me, which is in a couple of the Gospels. And that's Jesus on the cross, quoting actually from the book of Psalms. As we all know, translation is interpretation, and a selective one at that. The words of Jesus, as preserved in the Christian scriptures, contain, at best, one of the possible interpretations of the meaning of the original. The rest is lost. The language of Christ, as preserved in the New Testament, is the one put in his mouth by human translators or interpreters. The Hebrew Bible, according to Jewish and Christian faiths, includes the Word of God as actually uttered by him even before humanity was created. This is the key point mystically, right? When God said, Yehi or, he did not only convey the message, let there be light, he actually uttered these syllables. And as a result, there was light. God's utterance was not a semantic one. There were no people. Nobody could be listening. It could not be in order because there was no one to carry out the order. The very utterance was the deed, the cause of the emergence of the light. In other words, Hebrew, in the way the Bible describes God's relationship to language, is actually the language of holiness that enacts something in the world independent of the way that language functions in communication. It's not merely a language of dialogue. The truth about language is, anytime you open your mouth, even if you're speaking the language that you were born with, you are engaged in a process of translation of your ideas. Something originates here, you put it into a language, and it's a means of communicating your ideas to somebody else. But if there's no dialogue partner for God at the beginning of the Hebrew Bible, God is not communicating an idea, but rather using language to do something theologically and mystically in the world.
Also, the identity. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God. That's New Testament, but that's solid.
That's a midrash on this, right? Right. The Hebrew in this first function is valuable and part of identity because it has a mystical or theological significance outside of the fact that it's the language that we actually speak. And I think the insight on the contrast between Jewish and Christian mysticism is very telling. Christian mysticism was never about the text. Jewish mysticism was always about text. And in fact, the Kabbalah Center version of Jewish mysticism, right? And it's very telling. The Kabbalah Center version of Jewish mysticism is exactly right in this, because the Kabbalah Center theory of Jewish mysticism is you have to know what the letters look like, but you shouldn't know what the letters actually mean, or at least you don't need to know what the letters actually mean, because if a language is intrinsically holy, and it's words that God actually speaks. Don't be deceived by the meaning of the words. All you want to do is be in relationship to the letters that are the divine utterance in order to be in relationship to God. And in fact, the literal meaning of the words is almost idolatrous. The letters themselves are holy, much more than the words or their meanings. That's why, Madonna has tattooed the Hebrew letters. Anybody see this Madonna tattoo? Madonna has tattooed on her arm the Hebrew letters Lamed Aleph Vav. Why does she have the letters tattooed Lamed Aleph Vav on her arm?
Not tonight, I have a headache.
That's kind of a negative,
What's that?
that's kind of a negative tattoo.
Right. When rabbis read it, they think what it says is
Love.
don't do. Right? Lo ta'aseh.
Right.
If you don't actually know Hebrew, why would you put that on your arm? What does it mean?
Love?
Love.
Oh my God, I hadn't thought.
So the Hebrew letters have the quality of being theologically significant, but I can convey with them the message that I want to do. Right? It's wacky, but that's why she's not tattooing some arcane use of the lo ta'aseh, right?
We've been doing it with other languages, with other Jewish languages, Aramaic,
But
Latino,
when it comes, but the core of Jewish mysticism is rooted in the engagement with the letters because they represent a direct access to the Word of God.
It's reverse transliteration.
Yes.
We don't do it the other way.
The first idea here is that Hebrew actually has this function. And again, I don't think this is what the polemicists are arguing about, but it helps us understand at least all of the different ways in which a language functions as part of a Jewish identity. And the first function is mystical theological. The dark side of this is teased out by Gershom Scholem, the scholar of Jewish mysticism. Not surprisingly, a scholar of Jewish mysticism becomes aware of this. When he wrote in 1926, as Hebrew was being renewed, this is an excerpt that's reproduced from Abiezer Ravitsky's great book on Messianism, Zionism, or Jewish religious radicalism. He says in 1926, in a letter to Rosenzweig, that the renewal and secularization of the Hebrew language, I'm right in the middle of this paragraph on page 3, says, the land is a volcano. It provides lodging for the language, but what will be the result of the updating of Hebrew? Will the abyss of the holy tongue which we have implanted in our children not yawn wide? People here do not realize what they are doing. They think they have made Hebrew into a secular language, that they have removed its apocalyptic sting. But that is not so. Every word which is not simply made up, but rather taken from the treasure house of well-worn terms is laden with explosives. God will not remain dumb in the language in which he has adjured so many thousands of times to come back into our lives. If you believe in the theological significance of the Hebrew language, then turning it into a vernacular secular language is a fundamentally dangerous act.
This is the Haredi community's relation to spoken Hebrew.
That's a piece of it, right? You've actually, what you think has been a religious act of reclaiming the Lashon HaKodesh is actually a defamatory act to the Kodesh. In fact, Lashon HaKodesh, right, which we translate as the holy tongue, is a misnomer.
It's not Hebrew anyway.
Right, but what Lashon HaKodesh means at its core is the language of the Beit HaMikdash. It's the language of holiness. In other words, the language itself is loaded with theological import. It is almost like an artifact of holiness. Shalom's argument, which is based on the same thinking, because Don is a student of Shalom, is you can't play with language because it actually is invested with deep theological meaning. So idea number one about what Hebrew means is that Hebrew is actually this kind of dangerous, inviting access point to God's words and to theological or mystical significance. Right? That's idea number one. Again, I don't think that's what the polemicists are necessarily doing, but I think it's an important framework for us as we think about when we actually talk about Hebrew in relationship to identity, one of the things that Hebrew actually means. When we talk about, the loss of the ability to pray the words in the original, it's not just an identity problem. It's almost a theological problem. I can't say to God the words that I'm supposed to praise God in. The second idea, which I don't have any text for, but I think we all intuitively understand, is that Hebrew functions not only as this theological identity maker, but a political identity maker that is a means of identifying with the modern state of Israel.
Did this idea only really evolve after 67 or so when we really saw that Israel and Hebrew was a hegemonic challenge to the American way? because we were proud of Israel.
Well,
and
I would
Hebrew,
put it
and all of
differently.
a sudden it
The
made us
idea
feel
is the
inferior.
kernel of the idea that to be in relationship to Israel, to Hebrew, is to be in relationship with the state of Israel, or to be in relationship to Hebrew means to be in connection to the revival of Jewish sovereignty, is a much older idea. That goes back to Achad Ha'am. It goes back to the kind of revitalization of the Hebrew language as part of the renewal of the Jewish people. What you're asking, I think, is right, which is when Israel actually stands upright, and when American Jews start to feel psychologically inferior to the standing that Israelis have, then Hebrew becomes almost like, if you don't know Hebrew, you're not standing upright as a Jew.
And then when the American goes to Israel, the American feels inferior because, not
That's
because
right.
of Israel's
In
achievements,
fact, right,
but because of Hebrew.
right, exactly. Anecdotally, this is what a lot of American Jews like about going to Israel, which is, wow, there's Hebrew everywhere, right? And there's Hebrew on restaurant signs. There's Hebrew on street signs, right? There's like, this language is actually authentically Jewish, and it's being lived out in practice. And so identifying with Hebrew is essentially identifying with a kind of political identity. Without a doubt, some of the resistance to Hebrew in the American Jewish community may even subconsciously come out of that same phenomenon. Don't make Israel the place of authentic Jewish identity. I'm perfectly fine being a Jew over here, and therefore, in other words, the Hebrew becomes associated with the language of sovereignty and statehood in ways that can feel both inviting and alienating. There's like an idea here that I don't know how to unpack it, right? It's because it's so loaded, is that Hebrew, once you introduce the idea of a Hebrew-speaking state, is no longer simply a theological category, but is actually a very political category.
Yeah, are you thinking conceptually, or are you thinking practically? I'm sorry to ask, but I'm thinking of day schools where I spent an early part of my career and found a lot of our Israeli teachers, and I still think it goes on, had a kind of silo effect on some of our day schools. I don't know about the Orthodox. I mean, I know Ramaz pretty well, but I haven't studied the Orthodox schools. But in many day schools, we have real resentment about the little clusters of Israeli teachers who keep Hebrew as their own preserve in the teacher's room, and it does create an impediment.
Yeah, I'm thinking conceptually, but it plays out in practice, right?
And
In which
in fact,
Hebrew becomes, the desire for schools to teach Hebrew authentically means that the only people who wind up being able to teach Hebrew are Israelis,
Right, who may
which
not be
comes
language
with,
teachers.
that's right, usually this is the classic move of the American Jewish community is, I don't care what your profession was in Israel, when you're here, you're going to teach Hebrew in a school.
So another thing happens too, and that is in those schools, which occupy a major part of this discussion, I think, the accusation is given in reverse that, and therefore the Israelis don't understand our way, implying that there is an American organic development, which I think is the source of your question.
Right.
And so there's real antagonism on
That's right.
identity.
And so when Hebrew becomes associated with a state and a society, it gets all this baggage of identity.
And it doesn't have the
You have-
social
exactly.
elevation that French has. That is, if your teachers speak French, okay, so,
Right.
they'll go at Harvard, but Hebrew won't, or it may.
Exactly, right. Yes,
To
Denise.
kind of pick up on what Bill was saying, the other piece of that is that it's not just that it's associated with the political or culture, it's also that when I'll just say the Israelis come to teach Hebrew and we rely on that, they also don't have necessarily a feeling for the religious, what I'll call the religious part of our experience as Jews, because often they come out of, in our school, secular setting, and don't have an appreciation for that.
Right. And this is best.
What we would call
right,
Judaism,
exactly.
right?
And this is best. Right. This is best exemplified in the problematics of the Hebrew charter school phenomenon, which I'll say one thing on and then leave behind because I don't want to get locked into that. Which is the desire to make the Hebrew charter school phenomenon is a desire to make the feature of identity for the school is Hebrew language, but the only source by which to build an identity curriculum around language is from the state of Israel. So it's actually very inconsistent with the identity politics of a Jewish community trying to talk about Jewish identity. Because your only option is to talk through the language of identity of the state of Israel, where Hebrew has become meaningfully secularized. So if a Jewish parent is raising their children in a Jewish identity milieu in Los Angeles and sending their kids to a charter school in Hebrew charter school, which is talking about identity through a secular Hebrew milieu, it's a deep disconnect. And I think we're playing with something we haven't fully understood It's cheap, and that's why people are gravitating towards it, but it's not a fully understood dynamic. One more comment, yeah.
A couple of things. First of all, there is value to the learning of. I did go to a Hebrew school that was secular. My parents sent me to Talmud Torah in addition to that, but I believe that I got a really good foundation because of that Hebrew education. But one thing that I often think is that, wherever we live, we get shlichim from Israel, right? And, they're able to convey the message.
Same phenomenon.
I believe that we have a message to convey, to share with Israel. But we can't share it because we don't know Hebrew. If we were to go to Israel, how many?
Okay, I want to hold on to this comment because it's an important comment, but we already take for granted. And this is one of the problematics I'm trying to deal with. That if half the Jewish community knows Hebrew and half doesn't know Hebrew, that one community is at fault in that translation process. Not so clear to me that should be the case. But the shlichim phenomenon is part of the same thing. Who pays for the most of the shlichim who come from the state of Israel? The state of Israel. The state of Israel. So they're identified with essentially the political and social arm of a sovereign state. And they're here to do Jewish identity work in a place where that language of Hebrew is being thought of as a different phenomenon than where it functions in their life when they're back in Israel. So idea number 2 is the political significance. Idea number 3, and this is what I think Wieseltier is about, and that's why it's the source here, is that Hebrew is not about political identification, and it's certainly not about mysticism or theology, but Hebrew is about knowledge and authenticity. You're not an authentic Jew if you can't access the tradition, right, and the knowledge of the tradition in the original sources. You can be very smart and very learned, but if you're incapable of tapping into the tradition in its sources, you are somehow inauthentic. Now, authenticity is probably the most loaded word when you talk about Judaism or Jewish identity, right? Because it's only a means of saying whether you like somebody else or not, right? But that's a little bit of what's happening here, is that Hebrew becomes a metaphor for an authentic or an inauthentic transmitter of the tradition. If all you have is the tradition in translation, you are kind of intrinsically, at least from the perspective of this view, somewhat inauthentic in how you transmit it. Wieseltier says on page 5, the essay it's on public domain online and it's worth reading the whole thing, but he says on page 5, the American Jewish community is the first great community in the history of our people that believes it can receive, develop, and perpetuate the Jewish tradition not in a Jewish language. By an overwhelming majority, American Jews cannot read nor speak or write Hebrew or Yiddish. This is genuinely shocking. American Jewry is quite literally unlettered. The assumption of American Jewry that it can do without a Jewish language is an arrogance without precedent in Jewish history, and this illiteracy, I suggest, will leave American Judaism and American Jewishness forever crippled and scandalously thin. I'll skip down to the last paragraph. If we cannot make sure that we will be followed by believing Jews, right? And there's good reason to believe we will not be followed by believing Jews. We can certainly be sure that we will be followed by competent Jews. What can we do to create competence for our children, even if we can't perpetuate faith? In other words, when you live in an open marketplace, you're not going to, unless you're a fundamentalist, you're not going to produce other people who believe the same things that you do. But are you equipping them with a knowledge base to be able to make educated, learned Jewish decisions? Indeed, competence leaves a Jew favorably disposed to conviction. A competent Jew is not destroyed by his questions because he can look for the answers himself. He or she has the tools. Ignorance, I think, is much more damaging than heresy. This correlates to a classic Zionist idea. I don't know who coined it. Maybe you know, Bill. We set out to create apikorsim, and instead we created amarantzim. Right? We thought that we were setting people up to be heretics, and a heretic knows a lot and chooses to rebel against the tradition or make different choices. But the consequence of setting out to teach heresy is that you wind up being unlearned. For Wieseltier has conflated these two terms of Hebrew and knowledge. No such thing as being a learned Jew outside the context of access to the tradition.
It's like Berchevsky, who felt that. I don't think they didn't have I don't know what. I guess Wieseltier has hindsight.
Right.
Berchevsky can't have had the hindsight because until the 19th century, it wasn't a problem. And the biggest scandal was Sefer Haggadah.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
that is the easy access of Midrash.
Right, so he has hindsight, and he's looking at the contemporary Jewish community, and this is a classic polemic or lament. This is a community that is failing and is doomed to fail because it is not preserving the tradition in the language of authenticity. Yeah.
What troubles me a little bit is that, well, maybe the general population is more ignorant. The access to the knowledge is much easier because of all the translation.
Good.
If people wanted to learn, they wouldn't say, well, I needed someone to teach me Hebrew, and then I can go study something. I can look up so many things online, I can pull out so many books off the shelf that are written in English. So when he says there is no language, I understand what he means, Hebrew and Yiddish, but has a certain amount of English become part of, is there Judeo-English?
Right, so Sarah Benor at HUC is developing the theory that there actually is a Jewish-American dialect of English, and that's a little bit different what he's talking about. That's the adaptive process by which you speak a language in the society in which you're in, and you form that language. What he's talking about is a little different. I want to make your point a little stronger, if I may. What he's not acknowledging in this piece is that even if fewer and fewer people can access knowledge in the original, more people than ever before in Jewish history are capable of accessing Jewish knowledge. Right? Once the Talmud is translated into English, many more people are capable of understanding it than in previous times in Jewish history, where only the learned elite were actually able to access the knowledge. What Wieseltier is doing is, by connecting Hebrew to authenticity in this way, is trying to preserve a hierarchical educational system in a climate in which hierarchical educational systems are being destroyed. What he's demanding is not only a return to Hebrew, but a return to elitism. And more people need to be elites in order to be the ones who carry this tradition forward. So there's something I think we identify in this room with what Wieseltier is saying. There's something in this that I think we identify with.
Yes,
this room. People who read this because we're in the club. It's like, yes, we wish there were more people who had access to this tradition, and Hebrew is a signal of it. But there's also a piece of it that's a little tone deaf to modernity. This is not how knowledge works anymore. Right? And I want to come back to that question of, could you mount a credible claim of a return to Jewish knowledge by doing it in translation? Idea number 4, and this is the one. And then we'll round out. Idea number 4, Hebrew as a means of cultural separateness. Right? Not theology, not politics, not knowledge, but what if Hebrew is the means by which we are different from the Goyim? Is language the means by which we are different than others? And I do think that this is also an underlying undercurrent in some of these discussions. You want to perpetuate Jewishness? Find ways for Jews to be separate and different. And one of the ways, classically articulated in one of the famous rabbinic texts, is that Jews are different because they speak a different language. There's a famous text from Vayikra Rabbah.
Is that where the Jews never changed their names? And they
That's it right here, page 6. Page 6, yeah. Bar Kapara. Rav Huna says the name of Bar Kapara because of 4 things were the Israelites redeemed from Egypt. Right? Because they did not change their names, they did not change their language, and they did not speak ill of one another, and because none of them was sexually promiscuous. And there's another version of this text which says they didn't change their clothing. Now, we could spend a lot of hours on this whole idea, right? How do Jews create and preserve social separateness? What are the things that we do in order to be fundamentally different from a society? What's not said here is equally interesting, right? It doesn't mention intermarriage, maybe because it takes for granted that they're not intermarrying, or maybe I don't know what. Rabbis are looking for what are the things that Jews do that keep them different from others.
It doesn't talk about food or Shabbos.
It doesn't talk about food or other types of behaviors, right? It has locked into a couple of behaviors. What's that?
Bar mitzvahs.
No longer a mechanism by which Jews are different than others. The bar mitzvah phenomenon has taken off for non-Jews in America. Chuppah, no longer a difference maker between Jews and non-Jews. After the Clinton-Mezvinsky wedding, chuppah sales to non-Jews went through the roof. And it's a big market, non-Jews.
Bingo.
Right? What's that? Right?
Jewish Christmas tree.
Right. So the argument of Bar Kapara, a polemical argument, is that language is a mechanism of social difference. an enormous critique of this was offered by Gerson Cohen, the chancellor of the seminary, in 1963 or so, in a great commencement address he gave at Hebrew College called "The Blessing of Assimilation in Jewish History." You can hear the polemic in the title, in which he says, for centuries, Jews have been reciting this text and saying what keeps them different from others are not changing their names, not changing their clothes, and not changing their language. And he says, the key to Jewish survival throughout Jewish history has been the speed with which Jews have changed their clothes, their names, and their language.
The Andalusian.
The way in which we survive is through assimilation. Right? It's assimilating into a society in ways that we can actually perpetuate our own tradition. And until the 19th century, when ultra-Orthodoxy decided to obey this text adamantly by not changing their clothes, names, and language, the Jewish move has always been, quickly, dress like your neighbors, come up with names like Bill or Denise, right? Those are, right? And actually, in the early 20th century, the names that Jews tried to take on to sound like the names of their non-Jewish neighbors, by the end of the 20th century, had become identifiably Jewish names. Irving, Rose, right? This is the mechanism by which Jews actually assimilate. So we have a voice within our tradition that says, keep your language separate, because that will keep you different from someone else. And we have the reality of Jewish history, which suggests that's not really ever really worked. The attempt to actually preserve language as a means of being separate doesn't really work in terms of preserving identity.
What also, this may be another leap, but we also, when Jewish identity to a certain extent becomes part of American culture, through the film industry, through American comedy, which is overwhelmingly the language of comedy, is from Jewish. So in that sense, you have actually, again, what you'd call the Jewish identity or Jewish culture entering in and affecting the dominant culture rather, or at the same time as the other is happening. I don't know if you'd call comedy language, but it is the...
Right, and yet, that when you get into this business, it becomes very slippery. If you actually try to do a version of Lenny Bruce's Jewish Goyish monologue. People familiar? Jewish Goyish? If you're not, Google it. I'm not going to do it. But Lenny, what's that?
I hear you do it.
No. Lenny Bruce in the 60s has this famous monologue of this is Jewish and this is Goyish, which is exactly this game of trying to preserve the ways in which there's something Jewish about something that has no Jewish quality whatsoever, and something Goyish like white bread and lime jello that all Jews know are not fundamentally Jewish things. If you tried to do that today, it would be very, very difficult to do. Right? There's certain pop cultural phenomenon which seem very Jewish. Right? Larry David, he actually is Jewish, but there's something intended to be, there's something Jewish about it, but it's increasingly hard to differentiate between Jewishness and Goyishness, or more importantly, Jewishness and Americanness. Right? So yes, maybe speaking a different language may keep you separate, but the long-term proposition of that has never really worked. The big question, I think, for contemporary Jews is, and you'll know this very well, can people whose primary identity is through language, i.e. Israelis living in America, can they perpetuate a different identity among their children and grandchildren when their only marker of a different identity is language? And I'm going to go on the hypothesis of 2,000 years and say, no way. If you're going to try to ride it out on language, it has no long-term proposition of success. So that's idea. So idea number 4 here is that the difference maker, that the reason why we study Hebrew is to keep ourselves socially separate, where I'm undermining that as I say it, of saying even though our tradition has had that voice for a long time, I'm not convinced that it has a long-term proposition of actually working. The 5th idea is, and this is the last one, is Kaplan's take on Hebrew, which is very much derived from his veneration of Achad Ha'am. Kaplan comes along in Judaism as a civilization and writes about language as the marker of civilization. I feel it's good to talk about Kaplan, and I learned last week that he founded this place.
He was one of the 3 or 4 people who really...
So I feel like, it's a good tribute.
That was the University of Judaism.
That's right.
More than just a seminary.
Kaplan, writes a book in which uniquely, much of what you need to know about the book comes from the title, Judaism as a Civilization. It's been a long book. But one of the components that he talks about as what is the maker of a Jewish civilization is the use of language. And I have just a couple of short excerpts that we'll look at on pages 7 and onwards. A language is preeminently the distinctive mark of a civilization. That a common language gives people individuality seems to have been recognized at an earlier date. Skip to the next page, to page 8. Second paragraph, a language thus helps to keep alive the collective consciousness of a people. In the words of Zangwill, language is the chief index of life. As no man is dead so long as the mirror put to his lips reveals a breath, so no race is extinct so long as there comes from its lips breath of speech. A people that speaks is not dead. A people that is not dead speaks. What's that?
It's kind of true. We learn it, you think about all the Native American and indigenous peoples and their languages, they are trying to quickly preserve them throughout.
So the theory it's Kaplanian, right? Judaism is not a series of theological beliefs, all of which change over time. It is not really even about social separateness. It's about preserving intact the sense of belonging to a civilization, one element of which is the revival of its language. He says it much more explicitly on pages 12 and 13, when he's now in the part of the book in which he's being prescriptive and normative. What should we do in order to amount Judaism as a civilization? He says, in the last line of the page, or the last paragraph, where it's italicized, once Hebrew becomes a foreign or ancient tongue to the Jew, he ceases to experience any intimacy with Jewish life, and he begins to look for rational justification for being a Jew, with the consequent self-delusions and ultimate frustrations.
Yeah, but that's because up above, he already has joined the same principle you just talked about with Gerson Cohen, it seems to me.
Right.
Where he says all such prohibitions are out of place in the Judaism of the future, which will tend to assimilate whatever practices.
That's
So
right.
It seems like he retreats into the language thing because he's already posited the
That's right.
crisis.
In other words, there's not going to be a real meaningful social separation of values. What I think he is resisting is the argument of Bar Kapara that there's no difference in values between Jews and non-Jews. What there's going to be a difference is what are our cultural behaviors that make us identify with our own particular unique civilization. Right? It's a kind of emergence of, for lack of a better word, an ethnocentrism of Jewishness, which is defined not by who we marry, but what cultural civilization do we participate in. And Hebrew is one of the anchors of that cultural civilization. He says as follows, the first practical step in any effort to live Judaism as a civilization should be to learn Hebrew. It should be included among the languages that Jewish children are taught in the high schools and colleges, and it should be given the same academic credit as Latin and Greek. Wah, wah, right? Like that's not what we do anyway, right? The impression received during the first years of infancy and childhood are strongest and most enduring. During the first years, the child should breathe and live in a Hebrew atmosphere. It would be far more appropriate if in the Jewish homes, which can afford a governess, the children learn to laugh and play in Hebrew rather than French and German. The use of Hebrew in the religious services is natural and logical, as well as in the spirit of centuries of tradition. Right? Kaplan is making an incredibly traditional argument for a non-traditional context. Right? I don't need you to learn. He's not trying to perpetuate Hebrew because it's theologically significant. He's trying to preserve Hebrew because the means by which the Jew remains a Jew. Holds on to his own civilization through the knowledge of his own language. So here we have 5 different conceptual frameworks. This, to me, is part of a process of how do you tease out, right, what are we actually talking about when we talk about the meaning of Hebrew in terms of preserving Jewish identity? Are we talking about the politics of Hebrew, be in relationship to the state of Israel? Are we talking about the mystical or theological significance of Hebrew, right, that it actually is the Word of God, and the absence of the Word of God means we're doing something foreign? Are we talking about being inauthentic as Jews because it's the means by which we learn the tradition in the Hebrew? The fourth was, does this preserve cultural separateness? And the fifth, which is related, I think, to that last one, is it's separate, but it's not better. This is our society. This is our civilization. And these are its rules and these are its parameters. Before I go on, I want to take just a get any responses to this. Which do you, if you feel any sense, as we started on the outset, of this anxiety about the knowledge of Hebrew, or your perception with your congregants, your colleagues, and so on, about their own self-perception as Jews with respect to Hebrew, what do you think that they're referring to? Which of these paradigms do you see as them being most sensitive to? What do you think that your own anxieties or theirs or the communities are actually coming from?
Well, there's another phenomenon, that's that we have a lot of Jews by choice in our community now, a lot of non-Jews who are through intermarriage and such in the community, which makes the Jewish community more sensitive, I think, or at least in my community, more sensitive to when we're being somewhat Hebrew-centric. And so therefore they're a little bit more, there's a tension that they have with the separateness that they don't want, separateness in their own households. So therefore the Hebrew identifies for them these boundaries that they've been crossing. And so when you come to synagogue, they're appreciative when there's, if English to make someone else feel comfortable, so to say. So it's, when Bill said when, it made me realize that I was thinking about when I get off the plane with a bunch of, with the group I'm leading in a tour, they feel the Hebrew one way. When they come to synagogue, they feel this tension a whole other way. And sometimes the households are feeling it as well, especially when the Jewish partner has to bring the kids to Sunday school, Hebrew school, and the non-Jewish partner is ambivalent, or the Jewish partner is ambivalent because they're not the one doing it, but the non-Jewish partner is doing it.
I would suggest that is somewhere between 3 and 5, right?
Yeah.
Which is to say, I want my Jewishness to feel authentic, independent of the fact that it takes place. It's interpreted through through a translated version of the language. In other words, I'm trying to feel authentic as a Jew. And I think you're right to bring up the whole phenomenon of Jews by choice as part of this, right? If you set a bar of no Hebrew before you become an authentic Jew, that number, which is already low, is going to get lower. And it certainly goes to number 5 of what we as Jews have done, because I think many of us are Reconstructionists, like it or not, is built a notion of Judaism as a civilization, but jettisoned that language component. Right? We've embraced in Judaism in a highly Americanized ethos, but we've not set as the bar of participating in that Jewishness doing the Hebrew language, because it's basically, of all the things he lists in his book, the hardest one. And he does Jewish names. Yeah, it's easy to give your kids Jewish names, especially if you include the Macs, the Roses, the Sadies, right? Those are Jewish names. But language is such a high bar to set that we have kind of allowed Judaism as civilization to perpetuate itself by abandoning Hebrew as a critical component. Any others? Yeah.
Well, I'm talking too much, but it seems to me that there's, in my colleagues at Hebrew College, all 5 of these work at various times, and sometimes in a confused way. I respect my colleagues greatly, but I don't think they understand how often they kind of flit among, even the holy language part enters in, even though theologically I could never nail anybody down to that kind of literalism. But I think it functions. I'll give you an example, and I'll share it in public. I don't know if I should, but we have a big debate about whether Hebrew can better be taught Ivrit b'Ivrit. And nobody has a scintilla of evidence. Shmuel Bolovsky at UMass probably knows about it. So a few people know something about it. But we latch onto these things with their kind of religious fervor. And I would argue that I'll even include myself. We have elements of these 5 things, are kind of, and we draw on them at different times. I'm sorry.
That's right. So right, my kids are in an Orthodox and modern Orthodox and religious Zionist school in New York. There's a lot of Hebrew in the school. It is mostly on the what you might call mystical, theological, and political spectrum, meaning they learn to daven in Hebrew.
That's
and
the
there's
mystical part.
and there's a lot of Zionism, and so Hebrew becomes kind of routed into that. Most of what they learn in terms of Jewish knowledge and authenticity is not being taught through mastery of Hebrew grammar. It's being taught by Jewish educators who are trying to teach them Jewish values. And the theory of at least this school, because it doesn't do Ivrit b'Ivrit, is that Ivrit b'Ivrit would be ultimately a distraction to actually teaching Jewish values effectively.
Yeah.
Right? And Jewish schools that teach Ivrit b'Ivrit struggle with this all the time. What's better? What do we prefer? Having a fluent Hebrew teacher or a good teacher of the Jewish values? And the idea that you would find the combination of those is very difficult. Another example to this, rabbinic education includes, for almost all the seminaries, not the Orthodox ones, but almost all the seminaries, a year spent in Israel. right? It seems to have very little to do actually with the mastery of Hebrew, because if it was about the mastery of Hebrew, you would radically undermine the whole curriculum and spend the entire year studying Hebrew and talking in Hebrew. Because that would be about political identity with Israel, or civilizational identity, that a Jew needs to be fluent and knowledgeable in the Hebrew language. But the pressures of rabbinic education tend to be much more about knowledge and authenticity. And in this case, Hebrew, again, kind of works against the efforts to actually preserve or create a sense of Jewish knowledge and authenticity. Yes?
Another side we haven't touched on, right? Harold Kushner brings up the question of which side of the city you're looking at in America. You're on the Hebrew side, it's a mantra. Everybody's davening together. You get over on the English side, you suddenly get the theological, I don't believe this, you believe that. That splits the congregation. So one of the problems I perceive in Israel is, among the non-Orthodox, is that people understand Hebrew. So when they're davening in the prayer book, they know what it means. And they have disagreements and difficulties with that.
It's interesting. There's a clip that I didn't want to show today, but it connects to this point. In the show Northern Exposure, there's an episode in season 5, Kaddish for Uncle Manny.
Yeah.
Right, a great moment in kind of American Jewish cultural expression, when he spends the entire episode looking for Jews with whom to say Kaddish with throughout Alaska. By the end of the episode, announces to his friends, none of whom are Jewish, "You're my community, and this is the place in which I want to say Kaddish." And then, to prove your point, he says Kaddish in the original. In other words, he has broken down all of the boundaries that differentiate between him and other people as being essentially like those get in the way of this experience I have to have as a Jew of saying Kaddish. And you would think the corollary would be, now I'm going to say a prayer that you can all understand. But he actually says he has to say the prayer in the original in this like grasping at authenticity of what the prayer actually is. And so, and you assume he doesn't know what the prayer means and they don't know what it means. So it only has this quality of being kind of, it sounds different and it sounds authentic.
It's like going to the opera.
Right.
Well,
I don't
you
know
don't
what
know-
it's beautiful.
yes, right, it sounds
But I
great,
actually
but I
don't
don't
want to
know.
know what it sounds
Right.
like.
Can
Yes.
I was going to add to that, that besides that it sounds authentic and all that, another aspect of Hebrew, like that I think, I'm the one that goes to Israel, I'm like, yeah, everything's in Hebrew, and I
Right.
love that. But it also connects you with all those generations past. So when you study the literature of the Jews of Spain, they weren't speaking Spanish every day, or they weren't speaking Arabic every day, but they wrote the poetry in Hebrew. So they weren't speaking Hebrew every day, they were speaking Arabic. But they took the effort, so it's like, maybe people didn't understand every word of the Kaddish then either, but they said it, so it goes all the way back. So, you know, maybe I don't know every single word, or the people in my congregation don't know every word, but they can be authentic Jews in English, but the higher level is to learn that Hebrew. And my cousin always says a joke that when her son was complaining about studying for bar mitzvah, and the father said, you know, you two shall complain, and you two are going to learn it and have a bar mitzvah. So I think the ones that really liked it are the ones that preserved Hebrew all along. And that's maybe who we are, that we take the liking to it. And other people, it's the challenge, and, you know, there's other routes. But to me, the Hebrew is an important part. Yes, I think you can do all your Jewish stuff and learn it in translation, but that connecting with generations past.
Right, you lose that kind of sense of being belonging to authentic tradition.
Yeah, whether you understand
The-
every
right.
word literally of the Kaddish or not, that's not always the point.
Right. So at the risk of making the whole thing about pop culture, to the point about bar mitzvah, because this is a key at the final scene of my big fat Greek wedding, which I always say Jewish wedding. At the final scene of my big fat Greek wedding, she says to her daughter, "You can marry whoever you want, but you have to go to Greek school." Right? So in some ways, the Jewish communal policy has actually been reversed. We don't want you to marry who you want, but we're not going to necessarily invest in cultural education that will help you to situate why you see yourself as necessarily different. Part of my goal in laying out these 5 different approaches is to try to give us some language to figure out when we want to deploy Hebrew, or if we believe in the value of Hebrew, to figure out what the goals are. In what conceptual framework are we trying to deploy Hebrew? What are we trying to do out of each of these? And that will then shape how Hebrew is actually accumulated and learned.
Great question.
Right?
Is there
As
anything
opposed to
aspirational about this, though?
So let me take the last 10 minutes and do a last piece, to just, and I think I have 10 minutes left.
Yes,
I'm going to
you
use
do.
the last 10 minutes to throw another log in the fire. If these represent the kind of 5 different approaches to where Hebrew might fit in a Jewish identity, I want to take an example of the Jews of antiquity and the Jews of Alexandria as a equally illiterate Jewish community in Hebrew who didn't feel any guilt about it. Or at least the Leon Wieseltier of ancient Alexandria has not been preserved. It's only been preserved in the mouth of rabbis in the land of Israel looking with disdain at the Jews of
What
Alexandria
happened in
and
Alexandria.
critiquing them for not knowing Hebrew. Whereas you had a Philo of Alexandria, a character who I think would be untenable in the American Jewish community, who writes a 22-volume commentary on the Hebrew Bible without knowing Hebrew. There's good indications that he couldn't read in the original, he only knew it in Greek, and yet he felt sufficiently authentic and capable of writing a commentary about it entirely in Greek for Greek-speaking readers, which, again, it would be unimaginable that American Jews would mount the self-confidence to say, I don't know, I can't read the Bible in Hebrew, but I think there's something for this, but I'm going to write a commentary on it, right, on just the Bible as it exists in translation. So I wanted to look at a couple of examples of the tensions around the where does Greek fit in which we hear voices from the rabbinic tradition that are highly polemical about Greek, and voices from the Alexandrians themselves who are unproblematized by it. This will be my final question is, do we have to worry about this so much? Right? What would it be like for American Jews to actually figure out what are the facets of identity that we're really good at, invest in those, figure out when do we want to have Hebrew and invest to that, and stop letting the anxiety about Hebrew undermine the good things that we do about American Jewish identity when we're here. The sources I wanted to look at are, the first one is this crazy Gemara in Sota, near the end of Babylonian Talmud Sota, describing the end of the Hasmonean kings. After
Page 21.
Page 21. When the Hasmonean kings, by the end, the Hasmoneans only rule for about 100 years. Only about 10 of those years are well ruled. That's under the rulership of Queen Salome Alexandra. Most of the rest of the time, they are fighting with each other. And the demise of the Hasmonean kingdom was two brothers, Hyrcanus and Aristobulus, went to war against each other. And one of them, in order to defeat his brother, called in the Roman army to be his ally. And you don't ally yourself with the Roman army, you surrender. So when he calls in the Roman army to be his ally, that's when Pompey marches on Jerusalem, and that ends the Hasmonean kingdom. The Romans take over. The rabbis are describing this, and they give a cause for this that has nothing to do with that, but is their kind of ethical treatment of what actually went wrong in this moment. The rabbis taught, when the kings of the Hasmonean house besieged one another, Hyrcanus was outside the city, and Aristobulus was inside. Every day they would send down coins in a bank box, and they would send up daily offerings. What's happening here?
They're still producing the daily sacrifice, and they're making sure the other people are paying for it.
Well, it's actually, you can't have animals in the city. So the animals are are kept outside the city. They're sending down money, and they're sending up animals. It's a totally ludicrous situation where they're at war with each other, but both of them realize that the temple has to keep having the daily offerings. And they both need the temple to continue. And so they've worked out a financial transaction by which they're paying legitimately for the animals, but the sacrifice is on behalf of all the Jewish people. Right? I mean, this text can be used in a lot of ways, including the perversity of preserving ritual in the face of total ethical collapse. Right? This is like, you could,
Right.
I don't have any metaphors, but I'm sure you have some in your heads. There's a certain sage there who was conversant in Greek wisdom. Makir b'chachmat Yivanit. He spoke to them in that vernacular of Greek wisdom and said to them, all the while that they are immersed in the temple service, they will not be delivered in your hands. Right? If they're going to keep the temple service up, God's going to keep protecting the temple. If you're standing outside the city and you're trying to conquer Jerusalem, as long as they've got God on their side, and God is easily bought off with the sweet smell of roasted meat. As long as that continues, right, they're not going to actually wind up winning this war. The next day, they sent down coins in a bank box, and they sent up to them a pig. When it reached the midpoint of the wall, it stuck its nails in the wall. It's a horrible, viscerally horrible text. And the land of Israel trembled for 400 parsot. And whenever you get an image of an earthquake, it's a portending of a destruction that's about to come. Right? Much like in the Gospels, there's an earthquake the minute that Jesus dies on the cross. which, since the Gospels are written after the destruction of the temple, intends to convey the earthquake, and it says there's an earthquake after the crucifixion, and the crack emerged in the foundation of the temple, which is a way of saying the destruction, the killing of Jesus led to the destruction of the temple. So here too, an earthquake hits because of this pig sticking its nails into the walls of Jerusalem, which signals the Romans are coming. All right? Destruction is about to emerge. At that time, they declared, "Cursed be a man who rears pigs, and cursed be a man who teaches his son Greek wisdom." Now, there's a lot to do with this text, obviously, right? This has a lot to do with intra-communal warfare. It has a lot to do with the perversity of halachic observance in the face, as I said before, of ethical deterioration. There's a lot to do. And yet the rabbis throw in here, as the catalyst, that the only person who would come up with this kind of act of self-hatred and the destruction of our own identity is the Greek speaker. It's almost a gratuitous hatred of Greek language as the marker of the kind of social deterioration of our society. And the rabbis just throw that in as a way of implicitly polemicizing against Greek as the problem. Right? When there was a time at which we actually had good cultural preservation of language, our people was intact. And when people started reading things in translation is when we fell apart. This is the modern polemic. If only all Jews spoke Hebrew, then all of our problems would be solved. There's something that the rabbis, I think, are rightly teasing out as, wait a second, the city is literally being besieged by one another. How is Greek language the entire metaphor on which you're situating your own destruction? Did you have a comment or no?
Yeah,
I thought you had to. Okay.
When you finish, and then come back.
Okay, in contrast, the rabbis say elsewhere, and this is the second source, that they are aware of the need for Greek translation. Well, let me skip this one, and actually just do one more set of sources, which is sources.
Wisdom about language, or is it about philosophical?
It may be, but they use this term of la'az, the vernacular, and they're actually speaking in Greek language. The last pair of sources we'll look at, and then we'll wrap it up, is with respect to the translation of the Torah itself. Right, the translation of the Torah into Greek in antiquity, which we know is the Septuagint, which gets translated by 70 scholars. And we have two different versions of the story. One that the rabbis tell in the land of Israel, and one that the Greeks themselves tell in a story preserved called the Letter of Aristeas, where the Alexandrian Jews describe their translation of the Bible. If you only read the rabbis, look at Masechet Sefer Torah, a very late rabbinic compilation on page 22, it says as follows: 70 elders wrote the Torah in Greek for King Ptolemy. And that day was as ominous for Israel as the day whereon the Israelites made the golden calf, for the Torah could not be adequately translated. Do the rabbis like the Septuagint? No. The rabbis despise the Septuagint because, for reasons mystical and theological, as well as related to identity, how could you ever accurately translate the Torah? It must be almost an act of idolatry, because you've taken the Torah from its meaning and you're now reading it as though it's the Torah when it's actually something else.
They imply, though, that if it could be adequately translated, it would be okay.
Since it can't be adequately translated, it's not okay.
Translation Bichlal is no
Yes.
good.
But isn't there, I may be misremembering or romantic remembering, but isn't there also the Midrash that says to the effect of, they locked all the 70 scholars in the same, different rooms and independent.
Correct.
They all came out with exactly the same thing.
That's right. So the rabbis it's the same phenomenon. What happens is it is essentially an evil king who tests them by putting them all in 70 different rooms, and the God enacts a miracle of making them all translate it the same way to avoid the persecution that would happen from a king if they all came out and read some things that were different. But the whole framework for that is this is not something we would deliberately do. Chas v'shalom, we would actually translate the Torah into Greek. But if we're made to translate into it, God will actually give us a miracle and produce a good outcome. It comes out of the same worldview, right? Of this is not fundamentally a lichatchila act. It's not an act we would do on purpose. It's only an act that might be retroactively considered valid.
Who's Dorotheus?
So we're going to come to that. You're skipping ahead. So in Letter of Aristeas is a text that the Jewish community of Alexandria itself actually writes in the 2nd century BCE. And the contrast here to how the rabbis imagine the translation of the Torah into Greek is astonishing. Instead, what happens? Demetrius is the king, or Ptolemy actually is the king. Well, Demetrius is the king, takes the men, they choose men of the leadership of the Jewish community of Alexandria, and passing along the seawall, 7 stadia wide, to the island, crossed the bridge and made for the northern district of Pharos. There he assembled them in a house which had built upon the seashore, of great beauty and in a secluded situation, and invited them to carry out the work of translation, since everything they needed for the purpose was placed at their disposal. So they set to the work, comparing their several results and making them agree. And whatever they agreed upon was suitably copied out under the direction of Demetrius. And the session lasted until the 9th hour. After this, they were set to minister to their physical needs. Everything they wanted was furnished for them on a lavish scale. In addition to this, Dorotheus made the same preparations for them daily as were made for the king himself. Dorotheus helps the king. And for this he had been commanded by the king. In the early morning they appeared daily at the court, and after saluting the king, went back to their own place. And you have this amazing line. As is the custom of all the Jews, they washed their hands in the sea and prayed to God, and then devoted themselves to reading and translating the particular passage upon which they were engaged. And I put the question to them, why was it they washed their hands before they prayed? And they explained it was a token they had done no evil, for since in their noble and holy way they regard everything as a symbol of righteousness and truth. As I've already said, they met together and daily in the place which was delightful, for its quiet and its brightness, and applied themselves to their task. And so it chanced that the work of translation was completed in 72 days, just as if this had been arranged of set purpose. When the work was completed, Demetrius collected all the Jewish population in the place where the translation had been made, and read it over to all in the presence of the translators, who met with a great reception also from the people, because of the great benefits which they had conferred upon them. They bestowed warm praise upon Demetrius too, and urged him to have the whole law transcribed and present a copy to their leaders. After the books had been read, just to make sure that we know how positive this is, the priests and the elders and the translators of the Jewish community and the leaders of the people stood up and said that since so excellent and sacred and accurate a translation had been made, it was only right that it should remain as it was and no alteration should be made in it. Good story or bad story? This is the most philo-Semitic story of all time. The Jewish community is behind this effort. They are provided for by the king, who makes all the accommodations. The king is doing this because he wants to celebrate the Jewish tradition, and in a way that the Greeks can also appreciate it. And the Jews like it so much, as opposed to being locked in separate rooms, right? They compare notes with each other. They harmonize. They make the tradition alive in the way that they want to do it. This is a tension. I know I've given it a little bit short shrift, but a tension in our rabbinic tradition between the reality of Alexandria and the rabbinic tradition itself, exactly on the issue of if you can only read it in translation, is it so bad? From the perspective of the Alexandrians themselves in antiquity, not only is it not so bad, but it's worthy of celebration. Their identity as Jews is fundamentally intact for other reasons, which we haven't explored today. One of the big questions might be, what would it be like to mount a credible claim of Jewish separate identity that wasn't rooted in the knowledge of language? So I hope there's two major takeaways for today. One is, when we have a conversation, what? Okay. When we have a conversation about language and identity, in what way do we actually create some rigor to understand what it is we're talking about when we're looking to build a relationship with language and identity? And are there different policies, protocols, programs you can put in place to actually achieve your objectives in ways that don't get us into this mess of simply polemicizing in a kind of messy and problematic way about a complicated issue of identity? And the second question, and this is what I think is suggested by this Alexandrian text, is it possible for the American Jewish community to mount a credible defense of its ignorance of Hebrew? Right, as a legitimate expression of Jewishness, which not only is not undermining of us, but is actually something to be kind of in a weird way celebrated. So I'll stop. You had a question? I'll take a couple of questions. Do I have a minute to take questions, or we're out of time?
Got a few minutes. A couple questions.
Wait, you had a...
Dan's been waiting for a while.
Well, thank you very much. Masterful, very enlightening. Going back to Wieseltier for a second, and your criticism of Wieseltier, you use the word elitism as if it's a bad thing.
Oh, no, I believe in elitism.
Yeah, so I think the problem is not that we lack universal Hebrew literacy. That's you've made a good case that should not be such a problematic. But this may be the first generation, or this first couple of generations of the Jewish community anywhere, where even our leadership is And by that, I mean not only the secular leadership and the Federation leaders and the donors, the donor class, and the political leaders, but the rabbis. Let's note that when you read your text, you read them in translation. Those of us who teach in these institutions know that the new generations of rabbinic leaders are woefully less than masterful in their language skills. The Philo being the best and maybe only counterexample that you mentioned, translation is not the enemy of linguistic preservation. It's a sign of it, it's a proof of it. If you're translating text, that means that the text is useful and the interpretation for teaching it is important to you too. That's something that we've always done. The original, the first text that you brought, the contrast between Hebrew and Jews and Christians, really, we should put us in the middle, compare rather on one side Christianity, in which language was never important, and Islam, where language was the only important thing, and translation was never allowed. Prayer and text basically don't exist. We valued both text and interpretation. All of these examples, Philo is the only one that I think is the good counterexample, but we have not only valorized translation and interpretation, which is something that I think you've made a case for and probably agree. But the other side of that, the preservation of the text, at least in the hands of the educated class and the leadership class, that's what's disappearing. And we have only interpretation left. Anyway.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot to talk about with respect to what is a public policy that emerges from this, and whether it means, right, what does it mean to cultivate a literary and literate elite, as opposed to allowing the focus on the literary and literate elite to create anxiety about the masses. I think that's part of what happens, or the reverse is true also, because we want to allow people to simply be illiterate in Hebrew, we kind of allow it for our elites too. But the corollary question is one of priorities, which is, and look, a lot of our work with the Hartman Institute is with elites by design, but a lot of the work that we do with elites is about Jewish ideas much more than it is about mastery of the Jewish text. Now, again, that's mostly a priority question. If what's achievable within the frameworks that people actually allocate towards the investment in Jewish knowledge, and you have to kind of focus on the things that are actually going to work and that people are going to think is worthy of their time. And Ulpan is just not one of them. I think I probably share with you, and I hope this presentation doesn't misrepresent, I would love it if we were at the place that you were at. But when you're in a situation where you don't have your ideal reality constructed in front of you, and you have to make a specific set of choices under those constraints, that's where I think I'm trying to situate this presentation.
I just wanted to say, if anyone does want to take the tour in the library, it's 1:40. For anyone that wants to go, we have the room for 20 more minutes if you're okay. So I just wanted to put that out there. So why don't we just go around the room this way? So Shimon and Danny.
Folks have to leave, obviously.
Yes,
Is there a men's room nearby?
Men's room is down in that direction. I'm not sure. On this level, yes.
Yeah.
So Yashkoach for good analysis. That's number one. Number two, it seems to me, and I don't mean to take down day schools, I admire day schools, I'm a big supporter of day schools. But that's a tiny minority, elite of the elite, right? Those kids that don't go to Hebrew school, they're really not Hebrew school, it's preparation for a bar mitzvah. Let's face reality. And unfortunately, after bar mitzvah, you don't see these kids, most of them anyway. And also our discussion is discussed thoroughly in the Talmud. I mean, they come to a conclusion, at least if I remember correctly. In what language can you pray? You can pray in any language, except the Shema. Except the Shema. And even there's an opinion that you can say that also in your language. And yet the Talmud is loaded with Greek words.
Right.
I mean, there's so many words. You go to yeshiva and you study Talmud in depth, and there's one word after another, which is pure Greek.
Right. Right. It's always easier to polemicize about something than it actually is to live in the society that you're
Right.
polemicizing about.
It's a
Right. So
very-
the rabbis
Right.
are extremely aware of speaking Greek. In fact, their primary language is not Hebrew either. It's Aramaic. They're speaking Greek all the time, but they isolate Greek as being a kind of the social problematic. If we didn't have Greek, we wouldn't have all these problems, which to me finds a parallel here of if only we knew this, then we wouldn't have all the rest of the problems that we have.
Well,
It's kind of
also,
escapist.
you know, a lot of other cultures, America is really a assimilatory society in many ways. But other cultures have the similar problems. I hear Catholics complain that the Mass is not in Latin anymore, and they're having a problem to go back to Latin or not. And I tell them, I think the church made a big mistake. They should have kept the Latin, because there's something in the mysticism of the liturgy. Now, I was a congregational rabbi most of my career, and I thought, you know, people don't come to shul because they can't daven, and they feel uncomfortable to make a minyan. So I put a lot of effort into teaching Aleph Beis, to teach the people how to daven, and encourage them to come to a minyan. And then you had a community, because we're really community. And if they don't know the language, I saw a report some time ago that the people closest to the rabbis are the Orthodox, because they go to shul. And Reform and Conservative, how often do we see our congregants, right? It's when they need us. It's like a friend of mine who's a pastor says, they come to church for hatch, match, and dispatch. You know, the Jews throw in bar and bat mitzvahs, so we have them coming for that. If it weren't for bar mitzvahs, the shuls would be empty to face reality. So,
Yeah, I'm
we have to
I'm
make
not
an
sure it's a
effort.
single solution.
What?
I'm not sure it's a single solution.
I'm not
through
saying that's
language,
not a solution, I'm just
Yeah.
talking about, but the thing is, what's gonna bring people, how do we create a community? Federation's important, every organization's important, every organization that's positive anyway, or pro-Israel or pro-Jewish is important. Too many organizations fighting Judaism, fighting Hebrew, and fighting Israel. Every effort is important, but when you're out in the trenches, so to speak, and you see the reality of Jewish people out there, it's a hard job.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Go ahead, Gil.
This language and distinction of language. Eastern Europe is something else. There's ethnic communities. Yiddish was the language. Because you were in a town, my father's town, he was born in a little town in Ukraine in the 19th century. Jews spoke Yiddish, Ukrainians spoke Ukrainian, Russians spoke Russian, and Poles spoke Polish. So that was part of your identity package. But look at America, except for Haredim and Amish and groups like that, those groups which have survived as distinct groups in America have not done it on the basis of a separate language. Gaelic, nothing to do with Irish identity, which is strong. Italians don't speak Italian anymore, okay? Jews don't speak Yiddish, that disappeared quickly.
Right, but the whole point is that Jews are terrified of becoming Italians, because Italians is not a strong enough or thick enough identity to preserve a separateness from Americanness. Right, that's exactly the issue. That's exactly why Jews think that Hebrew is the solution. Because the problem is, if you lose your own cultural particularities of your identity, you become just like any other kind of flavor of Americanness, which is insufficient to actually sustain a community long term. My question is whether language is the marker of that, or other behaviors are the marker of that, or other attitudes, or other values or beliefs. And I think that's where the conversation needs to be thickened. Yeah.
Donnie?
A couple of things. First of all, a few weeks or months ago, I heard Amos Oz saying that Judaism is a textual tradition. And I think that we lose in the translation. And then I believe in balance. And I think we lost the balance because Hebrew is not at all valuable in our Jewish experience. I think it's possible to learn Hebrew to be more efficient, but lately I've been questioning American values and our bottom line and other things are more important. What's more important, the journey of the destination or the destination? They're both important, but we have to achieve this. This is urgent. So we leave what's important aside. And I believe that we lose depth of understanding when we don't know the Hebrew. Every Shabbat I find myself looking at, giving a drash in English and seeing that the translation doesn't convey the whole message that the text in Hebrew is giving, and the same thing with liturgy. And I feel that we neglected the Hebrew. If I'm not mistaken, conservative Judaism broke away from Reform Judaism because of the Hebrew, among other things, right?
And the shrimp.
Hmm?
And the shrimp.
The shrimp.
Okay.
The oysters.
I would, it doesn't,
It's a little-
either is oversimplifying.
But anyway, it's as Rabbi Shevitz says, even the leadership, the religious leadership doesn't have the depth of knowledge of the text that we should have. Throughout the ages, the rabbis wrote commentaries mostly in Hebrew and poetry and everything. Now, we write it in whichever language we live in. And I feel that it's not black or white, but it became a loss of balance, and I would like to see a resurgence of Hebrew here too.
Yeah.
Let me just go.
Last two, yeah.
Yeah, Yehuda and then Bill.
I'm glad to wait,
I'm curious, since you work at the Shalom Hartman Institute, and you talked about being in the business of Jewish ideas, and working so much with the United States, but you're based in Israel, how many of the thought leaders in America are saying, I need to write in Hebrew. Maybe I'll write it in English because that's my first language, but I need to translate in Hebrew, either A, to get the people in Israel to read it, or for 100 years from now to get anybody to read it.
Yeah.
Because just as Donnie mentioned, people weren't speaking Hebrew, but they said, okay, if I'm going to write something, I better write it in Hebrew, maybe for the mystical reason, but it's certainly the ones that were written in Hebrew, I think, were more preserved. So I wonder if people who are in American, at least think of themselves as thought leaders, say, okay, I'm writing in English, but I gotta write in Hebrew, or I gotta get somebody to translate it for me to make it sustainable.
I only know a few examples. I know Steve Greenberg, his book Wrestling with God and Man, on his experience as an Orthodox gay rabbi, has just had his book translated to Hebrew and is doing a series of events this week, actually, in Jerusalem. I think
Give us examples of what?
of thought leaders writing in English who feel that they have to translate into Hebrew in order to. But I think it's still at the place of, I want it to be in Hebrew because I want it to inform Israeli society, and not out of this kind of theological assumption that if I don't translate it to Hebrew, it's lost to history. That's right. I think most of the leading Jewish academic thinkers, whether in Israel or America, are still aware that if they don't translate it into English, it won't become part of the discourse. And that's true for Israeli academics too, that they still need to get their book translated and published in an English site in order to, it's a little bit by field. Hebrew scholars for a long time just wrote in Hebrew and disdained the American Jewish Academy, and I think the balance of power shifted. It may be on the verge of shifting back as Israel kind of asserts its own academic or intellectual independence in that way, but it's still not. It's not where you're talking about, which is if I don't write Judaism and Civilization in Hebrew, it's going to be lost to the canon of history. I don't see it yet. I'll take one last comment. Yeah.
Well, first place, I don't think you covered all of the nuances. I'll give one example, but this is the best presentation of a problem that those of us in this work face that I've ever heard.
Okay.
I really mean it. I go to a lot of meetings. We talk about one version or another of this. We get stuck somewhere in our patriotism or our authenticity or our mysticism, I don't know. And I'm in favor of all those things. Mm-hmm. But I do know, and I'd like to try to figure out what are the areas I think you didn't cover. I don't know what they are yet. No, I really don't.
You know how to get in touch with me.
No. What I'm trying to say is, as an example, when I teach a student, I do a lot of tutoring, because the students who are a little strong in Hebrew wind up started studying privately with me a little bit, just for a dessert at Hebrew Union College. And they get great joy out of the authenticity of approaching the text. But that means Hebrew, just to console you. But there isn't a day when I do one of those little seminarettes that I do that I don't think, boy, could I cover a lot of material if I could do this in English. With this caveat, and that this fits Sarah Benor and Larry Hoffman too, to some extent, and I think maybe Aryeh Cohen, my colleague from here, a sort of Hebrew special language in the midst of the English. The keywords, the teshuvah would be an example. I teach a lot of texts, a lot of different genres, and most of them do just fine, and excuse me for saying this, but most of them do just fine in English. But you still have to know what a ta'anit is, and you still have to know mishaberach, and I think we may be, and the implications of what you're saying may lead us to that someday. I can't imagine that I would continue insisting that a student read 2 paragraphs of a Hebrew 17th century text, which I'm teaching now, as opposed to reading 5 pages of it in English.
Yeah.
I just can't imagine
Look,
that.
and I'll say as the last word. I'll say as the
I'm
last
sorry.
word. No,
Please.
look, on a personal level, I had the experience growing up where when my parents were assigned to be diplomats in Israel, where they put me in an Israeli public school. And I was there for 3 years as a kid. I'm very grateful for it, of the ability to actually, I can actually move freely between spoken Hebrew and spoken English. I'm very much aware that I'm coming at this as an elite with respect to these issues. And yet, overwhelmingly when I teach in the American Jewish community, I teach unapologetically in English, precisely because whenever you teach with a little bit of Hebrew, especially in a mixed audience, all of this psychological baggage gets in the way of what it is that you're trying to do. And in fact, there are times when I oftentimes will teach Hebrew text in English without putting the Hebrew on the page. Because all it does is get in the way of self-doubt and self-loathing about what it is, and the one person in the room who thinks they know the text in Hebrew and wants to then make a nuanced point about grammar, which is probably wrong, but it's not what you're trying to do. So I am aware that this is personal for a lot of us, and also and there are big meta questions that we're struggling with, but I think there are also other implications for what it is that we're really trying to do that hopefully can get surfaced here. So.
Yeah, I just want to say by way of thanking that having come to this late in life and spent 3 years up there learning Hebrew and having virtually none of it take, I found this both enormously challenging and empowering and validating to have an intellectual basis to all of, as you said, all of the discomfort, and yet at the same time also validation for all these things. So from both the personal and the larger scale, I want to say thank you so very much.